The handcuffs felt cold, a biting contrast to the humid air of the store I had spent 3 years building from the ground up. My mother-in-law stood by the entrance, her designer bag clutched to her chest like a shield, a look of triumphant malice on her face as she told the officers I was a common thief. She didn't know that the deed to the entire building was sitting in my safe upstairs, or that her desperate attempt to humiliate me in front of the city's elite was about to trigger a legal avalanche worth $680,000. It wasn't just my dignity she was attacking. She was trying to dismantle the very foundation of my life, unaware that I was the one who held all the keys. Before the sirens and the shame, my life was a tapestry of quiet successes and soft linen. I lived in a sun-drenched house on the edge of the city, a place where the morning light filtered through the oak trees, casting long, peaceful shadows across the breakfast table. Every morning followed a cherished ritual: the scent of freshly ground bergamot tea, the weight of a heavy ceramic mug in my hands, and the comfortable silence between me and my husband, Mark. "You're heading to the studio today?" Mark asked one Tuesday morning, peering over his laptop. He reached across the table, his thumb grazing my knuckles. "You've been working so hard on this new collection, Elena. Don't burn yourself out." "I have to, Mark," I replied, smiling at the genuine concern in his eyes. "The grand reopening of the flagship store is in a month. Everything has to be perfect. The buyers are flying in from New York." Mark was an architect, a man who understood the geometry of buildings but struggled with the messy politics of his own family. He knew I ran a successful boutique, but even he didn't realize the true scale of my business empire. I had always been private about my finances, not out of distrust, but because I enjoyed the autonomy of being a self-made woman. In our marriage, we were equals, but in the world of high-end retail, I was E.V. Sterling, a name synonymous with understated luxury. Then there was Beatrice, Mark's mother. Beatrice viewed the world through a lens of inherited status and vintage pearls. To her, I was simply the freelance seamstress her son had inexplicably married. She lived in a sprawling, drafty estate that she could barely afford to heat, clinging to the remnants of a family name that had lost its luster decades ago. "Elena, darling," she had said during our last Sunday brunch, her voice dripping with that particular brand of polished condescension. "I saw a lovely little cardigan in the window of that new place, the Velvet Atelier. Perhaps you could find something similar at a thrift shop. I know Mark's salary only goes so far with your little hobbies." "The Velvet Atelier is quite expensive, Beatrice," I had replied, keeping my voice level as I sipped my tea. "But I think I can manage my own wardrobe." "I'm sure you can," she smirked, adjusting her silk scarf. "But there's a difference between dressing oneself and having style. Style requires a certain pedigree. It's not something one can simply buy or, heaven forbid, sew for oneself in a basement." Mark had shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes fixed on his plate. "Mom, Elena is very talented. You should really see her work sometime." "Oh, I'm sure it's very quaint, Mark," Beatrice sighed, waving a hand dismissively. "But let's talk about something else. Did I tell you that the Historical Society is considering my garden for the autumn tour? It will cost a fortune to get the hedges looking right, but one must maintain standards." That was the asset she was always after: money. Beatrice was a black hole of financial need, disguised as a guardian of tradition. She spent every penny of her dwindling inheritance on maintaining an image of wealth, and she looked at Mark as her personal ATM. She saw me as an obstacle, a drain on the resources she felt entitled to. What she didn't know was that the Velvet Atelier wasn't just a store I liked. It was the crown jewel of my company, Sterling Retail Group. I had purchased the entire commercial block 3 years ago, a move that had skyrocketed my net worth. To the public, I was a ghost. To my employees, I was the visionary who insisted on quality over branding. As the weeks went by, Beatrice's comments became more pointed. She started asking intrusive questions about our mortgage and whether I was contributing enough to the household. She would drop by unannounced, her eyes scanning our living room for any sign of extravagance she could criticize or, more likely, demand for herself. "This vase is new," she remarked one afternoon, poking a finger at a hand-blown glass piece I'd brought back from Venice. "Must have been a splurge. I hope you aren't being reckless with Mark's hard-earned commissions, Elena. A man in his position needs a nest egg, not expensive trinkets." "It was a gift to myself, Beatrice," I said, my patience beginning to fray. "And Mark and I are doing just fine." Of course," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But you know, the family estate needs a new roof. It's a tragedy, really. A piece of history rotting away while people buy glass jars." She didn't just want the roof fixed, she wanted a lifestyle she hadn't earned. And as I prepared for the most important day of my career, the secret inspection of my flagship store before the high-profile relaunch, I had no idea that Beatrice had been doing some investigating of her own. She had spotted me entering the back office of the Velvet Atelier several times, and in her twisted mind, she hadn't concluded that I owned it. No, Beatrice had decided that I was a thief, or perhaps something worse, and she was preparing to use that truth to excise me from her son's life once and for all. The tension in the air during those final days was palpable, like the static before a thunderstorm. I noticed Beatrice and Mark whispering in the hallway during a dinner party, Beatrice's face flushed with a dark, frantic energy. When I approached, they both went silent. "Is everything okay?" I asked, looking from Mark's guilty expression to Beatrice's icy stare. "Everything is perfectly fine, Elena," Beatrice said, a strange, sharp smile stretching her lips. "I was just telling Mark that justice has a funny way of finding people, eventually. Don't you agree?" I didn't answer. I just felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine, a premonition that the quiet, cozy life I had built was about to be torn wide open. I thought I was protecting my business by keeping it private, but I was actually handing Beatrice the very weapon she would use to try and destroy me. The week following that dinner party felt like walking through a house where the floorboards had been loosened, one by one. The air in our home, once filled with the scent of vanilla candles and the sound of easy laughter, became heavy and clinical. Mark, usually so present, began to drift into a shadow of himself. He stopped asking about my day. When I would talk about the shipment of Italian silk or the lighting fixtures for the store, he would merely nod, his eyes fixed on some middle distance, his fingers drumming a nervous, erratic rhythm on the table. "Mark, you're miles away," I said one evening, touching his shoulder. He flinched, a small, sharp movement that felt like a slap to my heart. "Just work, Elle. Big deadline, you know how it is," he mumbled, pulling away to check something in the kitchen. But it wasn't just work. The warnings were everywhere, subtle as a hairline crack in a windshield. I found Beatrice's car parked at the end of our driveway late at night, her headlights off. When I walked out to ask if she needed help, she simply sped away. Then there were the phone calls. Mark would take them in the backyard, his voice low and frantic, glancing back at the house to see if I was watching. The most chilling sign, however, came from my store manager, Sarah. She called me on a Thursday morning, her voice trembling. "Elena, I didn't want to bother you, but that woman was here again, the one you said was your mother-in-law." "Beatrice? What was she doing there, Sarah?" "She wasn't shopping," Sarah whispered. "She was taking pictures of the back entrance, the security cameras, and the private office door. When I asked if I could help her, she looked at me with such... Honestly, Elena, it was scary. She told me she was documenting the evidence of a fraud and that I should start looking for a new job before the police arrived. She said you didn't belong here." My blood ran cold. "Did she say anything else?" "She asked if I knew where the stolen inventory was kept. I told her I didn't know what she was talking about, and she just laughed. She said, 'The truth will come out at the opening, and my son will finally be free.'" I hung up, my heart hammering against my ribs. I tried to dismiss it as Beatrice's usual dramatics, a woman desperate for attention, But a seed of genuine dread had taken root. The point of no return arrived on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Mark had gone to the gym, leaving his tablet behind. It was an unusual oversight. He was usually glued to it. I was cleaning the study when it chimed repeatedly, message after message from a contact saved only as M. I shouldn't have looked. I knew the sanctity of privacy in a marriage, but the atmosphere of the last few weeks had eroded my restraint. I swiped the screen. It wasn't locked. The messages weren't from a mistress. They were from Beatrice. I've talked to the sergeant, the latest one read. He says if we catch her in the act of managing the property she has no legal right to, we can have her removed for trespassing and fraud. We just need to make sure she's there when the patrol arrives. Are you ready to do what's necessary, Mark? For the sake of the family name? My breath hitched. I scrolled up, my hands beginning to shake so violently, the tablet nearly slipped from my fingers. There were photos, grainy shots of me entering the building with my key, me sitting at my desk, me signing for deliveries. Underneath one photo of me laughing with the vendor, Beatrice had written, "Look at her, playing the high society lady with money she's siphoned from your future. This boutique is a front, Mark. I've checked the public registries for Elena Sterling and found nothing. She's hiding something massive." She hadn't found anything because the business was registered under Sterling Retail Group, an LLC I'd formed years ago, and the building deed was in my maiden name, Vaga. She had done just enough research to convince herself of a lie, and Mark hadn't corrected her. "I don't know, Mom," one of Mark's replies read. "She seems so dedicated to it. Are you sure about the legal side? If we do this at the grand opening, there's no going back." "It's the only way to save you from her lies, Mark. She's a parasite. Trust me." The world around me began to tilt. A high-pitched ringing started in my ears, drowning out the sound of the rain against the window. I felt a wave of cold nausea wash over me, the kind that makes your skin feel clammy and your knees turn to water. I had to sit down on the floor, the tablet glowing like a radioactive coal in my lap. My husband, the man I had shared a bed with for 7 years, the man I thought was my partner, was discussing my arrest with his mother. He wasn't defending me. He was considering it. He was letting her poison his mind. Or worse, he was hoping she was right, so he could claim some sort of moral or financial high ground. I felt a physical sensation of something breaking inside my chest. A clean, sharp snap. The Elena who believed in the sanctuary of her marriage died in that moment. I forced myself to breathe. In, out. In, out. My pulse was a frantic drumbeat in my throat. I needed more than just text messages. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and went to the guest room where Beatrice stayed when she visited. She had left her heavy leather satchel there while she and Mark went for their walk in the park. My fingers were numb as I unzipped the side pocket. Inside was a thick manila folder. I pulled it out. It was a meticulously prepared dossier. There were printouts of local trespassing laws, a drafted letter of intent to the landlord of the building, which ironically was me, reporting an illegal subletter, and a pre-written statement for the police. But the most damning thing was a printed email from a private investigator Beatrice had hired. The investigator had written, "While I cannot find a direct link between Elena Sterling and the ownership of the Velvet Atelier through standard searches, the building itself is owned by a holding company. I suggest a public confrontation to force her hand." Beatrice had handwritten in the margin, "Catch her at the opening. Call the police. humiliate her so publicly that Mark will have no choice but to annul. We will claim she's been using family funds to support a fraudulent business venture. I stared at the words until they blurred. They weren't just planning to stop me. They were planning to destroy my reputation, my business, and my legal standing in one blow. They wanted to paint me as a thief in my own house. I heard the front door open. Mark's voice called out, "Elena, you home?" I shoved the folder back into the bag, my heart leaping into my throat. I wiped my face, smoothed my hair, and stepped out into the hallway. My vision was tunneled, the edges of the world dark and blurred. But as I looked at my husband standing there, looking so ordinary, so kind, a new sensation began to replace the shock. It was a cold, crystalline anger. It was the realization that at darkness, not the one in danger, they were. They were walking into a trap of their own making, and Mark the door locked behind them. "I'm here, Mark," I said, my voice sounding strangely hollow, like it was coming from a long way off. "Everything okay?" he asked, tilting his head. "You look pale." "I'm fine," I lied, the word tasting like ash. "Just thinking about the grand opening. It's going to be a day to remember." The night of the grand opening, the Velvet Atelier was a jewel box of light and sound. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the hum of 100 elite voices. I wore a gown of my own design, a deep midnight silk that felt like armor. Every time I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the freelance seamstress Beatrice despised. I saw the woman who had built an empire while her husband's family survived on the fumes of the past. The glass doors swung open, and I saw them. Beatrice was dressed in an outdated fur stole, her eyes darting around the room with a predatory gleam. Mark followed a few steps behind, looking like a man walking toward his own execution. He couldn't even meet the gaze of the tuxedoed server who offered him champagne. I stood at the top of the small mezzanine stairs, watching as Beatrice marched toward the center of the floor. She didn't look at the clothes. She looked at the cameras, then at me. "Elena," she called out, her voice cutting through the sophisticated murmur of the crowd. "Stop this charade immediately. I've given you enough time to come clean, but your vanity clearly knows no bounds." The room went silent. I felt the collective gaze of the city's most influential buyers and journalists shift from the displays to me. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and for a second, the room blurred. The slow motion feeling returned. The faces of the guests became distorted masks of curiosity and judgment. "Beatrice," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, "you're interrupting a private event. If you want to talk, we can do it in my office." "Your office?" Beatrice laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "You mean the office you've broken into? The business you've been using to launder whatever pittance you've been scraping together? I've already called the authorities, Elena. They are 3 minutes away." She turned to the crowd, her face twisted in a mask of righteous indignation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am so sorry for this disruption, but this woman, my daughter-in-law, is a fraud. She does not own this store. She has been posing as its proprietor to gain social standing, likely using funds stolen from my son's architectural firm. It's a tragedy of the highest order." I looked at Mark. He was standing near a display of hand-stitched leather bags, his face ashen. "Mark," I whispered, the sound carrying in the sudden vacuum of the room. "Are you going to let her do this?" Mark looked down at his shoes. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He stood there, a silent statue of cowardice, paralyzed by the umbilical cord his mother refused to cut. "Mark, look at me," I said, louder this time. "Did you tell her I was a thief? Did you help her compile that folder in her bag?" Finally, he looked up, and the betrayal in his eyes was worse than the silence. "Mom said the numbers didn't add up, Elena," he stammered, his voice cracking. "She said you were hiding accounts from me. She said
She said the only way to protect the family from a massive lawsuit was to expose the truth before the real owners found out. I just wanted to help you before it got worse. To help me? I felt a cold, sharp laugh bubble up in my throat. By calling the police to my own grand opening? The blue and red lights began to flash against the store's floor-to-ceiling windows. 2 officers entered, looking confused by the opulence and the formal attire of the guests. Beatrice practically lunged at them. "Officer, thank God you're here," she cried, pointing a trembling finger at me. "That woman, she is trespassing and committing grand larceny. She has no lease, no business license, and she's been occupying this building under false pretenses. I have the documentation right here." She pulled the manila folder from her bag, the one I had seen in her room. "I've done the research. The Sterling Retail Group owns this building. My son is a Sterling. She is an interloper who has stolen the name and the credit." The lead officer looked at me. "Ma'am, do you have identification and proof of ownership for this establishment?" "I do," I said. My voice was no longer trembling. It was as cold as a winter grave. "But before I show you, I'd like to ask Beatrice one question." I stepped down the stairs, the silk of my dress hissing against the floor. I stopped just inches from her. She smelled of stale perfume and desperation. "Beatrice," I said softly, "why were you so eager to expose me tonight? Was it really for the family name? Or was it because you've already signed a contract with Vossen and Company to sell the rights to this lease for $500,000?
A lease you don't even own? The color drained from Beatrice's face. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw genuine terror. I don't know what you're talking about. I found the draft in your bag too, I lied. I hadn't found it, but I knew Beatrice. She was a gambler, and she was drowning in debt. I'd seen a Vossen & Co. business card in her wallet. It was a calculated risk, and the way her lower lip began to quiver told me I'd hit the mark. "Mark?" she gasped, turning to her son. "She's lying. She's trying to deflect." But Mark was looking at his mother now with a new kind of horror. "Mom, did you try to sell the store's lease? You told me we were just stopping a crime." "I was securing our future," Beatrice shrieked, her mask finally slipping. "You deserve that money, not this little seamstress. She's been hoarding millions while I can't even afford to keep the lights on at the estate. She owes us." "I owe you nothing but the truth, Beatrice," I said. I turned to the officers and handed them my heavy, embossed leather portfolio, which I had kept behind the counter. "In here, you will find the original deed to this building, purchased by me, Elena Varga, 4 years ago. You will find the incorporation papers for Sterling Retail Group, of which I am the 100% shareholder. And you will find the tax returns showing exactly where every cent of this stolen money came from." The officer spent 5 minutes leafing through the papers. The silence in the room was so thick, you could hear the bubbles popping in the abandoned champagne glasses. The officer looked up, his expression grim. He looked at Beatrice, then at me. "Everything seems to be in order, Ms. Varga. Actually, it's quite impressive." Beatrice began to hyperventilate. No, that's not possible. She must have forged them. Mark, tell them. Tell them she's a liar." I turned to my husband. This was the moment. The final, silent betrayal. Mark looked at the officers, then at the mountain of evidence, then at his mother's frantic, ugly face. I didn't know," he whispered. "That's not enough, Mark," I said, my voice cutting through his weakness. "You didn't know because you chose to listen to her venom instead of looking at the woman you married. You chose her greed over my hard work." "Elena, please," he started, reaching for my hand. I stepped back, as if his touch were toxic. "Officer," I said, looking the lead man in the eye, "I want to press charges, not just for the scene she's caused tonight, but for the attempted fraudulent sale of my property and the harassment of my staff. And Beatrice? She looked at me, her eyes red and streaming with tears of rage. The cardigan you liked in the window? I whispered, leaning in so only she could hear. It's worth more than your entire estate, and you're never going to wear it. You can't do this, she screamed as the officers took her arms. I'm a sterling. You're nothing. As they led her out in handcuffs through the crowd of onlookers, the flashbulbs of the local press, who she had likely invited to witness my downfall, captured every second of her disgrace. Mark stood in the center of the room, abandoned and broken. What happens now? He asked, his voice trembling. Now, I said, turning my back on him to greet my guests. I start the life I should have had years ago, without you. But as I walked away, I felt a weight in my pocket, a second phone. A notification had just popped up from my private investigator. There was one more twist I hadn't expected. Beatrice hadn't been working alone. The Vossen she was talking to wasn't just a buyer. It was Mark's business partner. The betrayal went even deeper than I thought, and the $680,000 case I was about to build wasn't just against a bitter old woman. It was going to take down everyone who had ever underestimated me. The morning after the grand opening, the sun rose over the city with a cold, indifferent clarity. I didn't go back to the house we shared. I spent the night in the small, elegantly furnished suite above the boutique, listening to the hum of the city and the silence of a life that had been hollow for far longer than I cared to admit. The shock had passed, replaced by something far more dangerous, a quiet, focused precision. My emotions hadn't just cooled, they had frozen into a sheet of ice, and I could see my path forward with terrifying sharpness. I sat at my mahogany desk, the one Beatrice had called pretentious, and looked at the data my investigator had sent. It wasn't just Beatrice's greed. Mark's architectural firm had been hemorrhaging money for 18 months. He hadn't told me because he was too proud, and he hadn't asked for help because he saw my success as a personal affront.
He and his partner David had been looking for a way out, and Beatrice had provided one. They were going to use the scandal of my supposed fraud to void any marital claim I had to our joint assets, while simultaneously selling the lease of the building, which they had convinced themselves belonged to a defunct trust, to Vossen & Co. for a massive kickback. The total value of the fraud, combined with the damages to my company's reputation and the personal assets they had tried to siphon, totaled exactly $680,000. I called my attorney, Marcus Forn, at 7 in the morning. Marcus was a man who didn't just win cases, he dismantled people. Elena, he said, his voice gravelly. I've seen the police report from last night. It's all over the morning news. Socialite mother-in-law arrested at flagship opening. You've certainly made a splash. I want them finished, Marcus, I said, my voice steady. Not just Beatrice, Mark and his partner David too. I have proof of their collusion. I want the full amount, every cent of the $680,000, and I want the house. Consider it done, Marcus replied. But you know this means a public divorce. It's going to get uglier before it gets better. It can't get any uglier than a husband watching his wife be handcuffed for a crime he knows she didn't commit, I said. Let's begin. The following weeks were a whirlwind of depositions and legal filings. I didn't see Mark until we met in a sterile, glass-walled conference room for the final mediation. He looked terrible. The polished, confident architect was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he hadn't slept in a month. His firm was already under investigation for financial irregularities, and his partner had already flipped, offering testimony against Beatrice and Mark to save his own skin. Mark sat across from me, his hands trembling as he gripped a pen. Elena, please, he whispered when the lawyers stepped out for a moment of private consultation. Can't we talk? My mother, she's an old woman. She's in a psychiatric ward now. She wasn't in her right mind. I looked at him, and for the first time in 7 years, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a clinical curiosity as to how I had ever loved someone so small.
She was in her right mind when she hired a private investigator to follow me, Mark. And you were in your right mind when you checked the legalities of me being arrested so you could pay off your firm's debts. I was desperate, he barked, his voice cracking. I felt like I was drowning and you were just winning. You never needed me. I didn't need you for your money, Mark. I needed you for your loyalty, I said, leaning forward. You thought I was a seamstress playing dress-up. You forgot that to build a business like this, I had to be a shark. You chose to jump into the water with me. Now you're going to find out how deep it goes. The settlement was brutal. To avoid a lengthy prison sentence for conspiracy and fraud, Beatrice had to liquidate her beloved estate, the pedigree she had used as a weapon against me. The proceeds went directly into a trust for the $680,000 judgment. Mark lost his share of the firm and the house. He was left with nothing but his name, which was now a punchline in the city's business circles. The final day of the proceedings, as I signed the papers that officially ended our marriage, Mark looked at me one last time. I really did love you, Elena. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal wool coat. Love isn't a feeling, Mark. It's a series of choices, and you chose her every single time. 6 months later, life had returned to a new kind of normal. The Velvet Atelier was no longer just a boutique. It was a landmark. The scandal had only increased its allure, and my new collection was sold out 3 months in advance. I was back in my house, the house I had bought back from the bank with the settlement money. It was quiet now, but it wasn't lonely. The oak trees still filtered the morning light, but the shadows they cast no longer felt like a warning. I stood on the veranda, the same place where Beatrice had once mocked my glass jars. I was holding a cup of tea, the steam rising in the crisp morning air. I looked out over the garden I had replanted, no more suffocating hedges, just wild, beautiful flowers that grew wherever they pleased. The phone on the table buzzed. It was a message from Sarah at the store. The New York shipment just arrived. It's perfect. We're ready for the fall season. I smiled, a genuine, warm sensation that reached my eyes.
I had lost a husband and a mother-in-law, but I had gained something much more valuable. The realization that my worth was never something they could give me, so it was never something they could take away. I sat down in my favorite chair, feeling the weight of the ceramic mug in my hands. The silence of the morning was no longer heavy with things unsaid. It was light, airy, and entirely mine. Betrayal is a fire that either consumes you or forges you into something unbreakable. As I watched the sun climb higher into the sky, I knew which one I had become. The past was a closed book, and the future was a blank page written in my own hand. In the end, Beatrice was right about one thing. Pedigree does matter, but it isn't something you're born with. It's something you build, stitch by stitch, until you are the only one who can wear the crown.